In this session, we're going to explore the concept of standard deviation and use Excel to show how to calculate standard deviation, both sort of the long way and also the very short way. To begin with, we'll assume that we want to know what the height of students is in a school, and we're going to determine that height by taking a sample of 10 students in a particular class. So we're going to begin by simply listing out the heights of our students, and we're going to select a sample of 10 students. If we were doing this for real, we would actually measure the students or ask them their height or do something. For now, I'm just going to make up some numbers here that would represent heights of students in a class. So we have our data collection going on here. Again, if we were doing this for real, we would be actually measuring or sampling students in a statistically valid way. The first step in calculating standard deviation is to determine the average height of the students. Now, the statistical word for average is mean, but the Excel formula is the word average. So in order to calculate the average, we're just going to simply type in equal average and then drag our mouse around the range of cells that we want to average, and we find that this listing of 10 students has an average or mean height of 70.6 inches. The next step in calculating standard deviation is to determine the distance between each data point and the average. And each data point is referred to as an X. The average is referred to as a M, or mean. And so in each case, we're simply going to subtract the mean from each data point. And we do that in Excel by doing a fairly simple formula. One of the things that's going to help us when we copy this is to create a fixed cell reference. I did that by clicking on F4, and if you notice, once I hit F4, function key 4, it puts a $sign in front of the column, a $sign in front of the row, and as I copy that from one cell to the next, it has the effect of always making the second part of this formula the average. So it doesn't change as I move from one cell to the next. The next step in the calculation is to square the calculation that we just performed. So we're going to do x minus m squared, and we do that by simply doing this kind of formula. In Excel, this little caret sign is how you square a number. So do that. And then the next step we're going to do is add the squares together. And the Excel function for adding something is simply the word sum. Again, then I'm going to highlight the cells that I want to add together. So we have 118.4 as the sum of squares. Now, if you notice, when we square things, basically it has the effect of removing the negative when the value is below the mean. The next thing we need to do to calculate standard deviation is to calculate the degrees of freedom. In this particular case, the degrees of freedom is the count of the values minus 1. Now this assumes that the data that we're analyzing represents a sample of the entire population and that it is not the entire population. So in this case, Excel has a neat little function called count that lets me count the values, and then I simply subtract 1 from that, and you can see I have 9 degrees of freedom. And then I'm going to divide the sum of the squares by the degrees of freedom, and that is called the variance. The variance is an indicator of how dispersed the data are. The standard deviation, which is the more common measure that's used, is simply the square root of the variance. Typing here. Okay, square root of the variance. The Excel function for square root is sqrt, square root of the variance. So I have a standard deviation of 3.62. This data has a mean of 70.6 and a standard deviation of 3.62. These two things together give us a pretty good idea of what this data set looks like. In the next lesson, what we'll do is look at how the mean in and of by itself isn't really enough information to describe most data. We also need the standard deviation number to describe the data. The shortcut for standard deviation is an Excel formula also, and that Excel formula is a fairly simple one called STDEV. So as we move through the course, what we'll do is use STDEV as the standard deviation function. And you can see what I've done is simply type in equal STDEV and then highlighted the data that I want to perform a standard deviation for. And it is the same as the manual way that we did this. It's important that you have an understanding of how this works, but it's also going forward, we'll simply use the formula for this.